In considering the invitations of God to us as people, my thoughts have meandered towards the miracles of Christ. And I realize that on the surface, that might seem a little strange, but I hope you'll hear me out. So often, when we think of miracles, we think of wonderful acts God has done to and for humankind. And yes, the miracles of Jesus were founded upon divine intervention of God into human trials and tribulations. But I think when we take a closer look, we see that by design, God used the everyday stuff of earth, mud and spit, water and fish, and us, ordinary people, to accomplish his extraordinary, miraculous work. God extends to us an invitation to participate in his life changing, kingdom building work. And so often he extends that amazing invitation to us in the most ordinary manners. Think about it. Jesus turned water into wine, so it's probably not too far fetched to think he could have just offered a prayer and poof, had pots full of whatever he wanted them full of. And yet he chose to involve the wedding servants that day at Cana. He told them to go and fill the pots with water, the very water he would turn into the wedding's finest wine. It occurs to me that these servants knew exactly where the well was located and how to follow through with the orders Jesus gave. And when all was said and done, these were the people who would be able to attest to the fact that it absolutely was plain old water that had been in those jugs before they had made it to the hands of Jesus. I can imagine the sense of dignity, the pride that these workers must have felt upon going home that day, knowing what their ordinary daily labor had contributed to. How about when Jesus called upon the disciples to distribute the fish and loaves that came from a kid's sack lunch? By using the disciples' hands and feet, Jesus empowered them. He gave them a foretaste of the work that they would be a part of in the days and years to come, all the while getting the multiplied food to a tired and hungry crowd that was looking to him to supply for their physical needs. And then I was thinking about the account of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. He could have easily just gone into the tomb and then presented Lazarus to the crowd while soaking up their oohs and ahs, their amazement. Heck, he didn't even need to bother with going into the tomb at all. He could have just called Lazarus forth and then watched his dramatic exit. And yet we read that Jesus intentionally involved others who were standing there that day in the process. He might have even involved Mary and Martha themselves. And calling Lazarus from the grave, we see Jesus allowing his friends gathered there to play a role in freeing Lazarus by taking off the gauze and the linen that he had been swaddled in for burial. These would have been the first people Lazarus would have seen as the bandages were removed from his eyes and as he returned to life from death. Over and over again, we see that rather than doing these wonderful actions himself, Jesus invites and involves others. So Luke tells us one day Jesus was teaching in a house in Capernaum, and some everyday, ordinary people who were traveling to hear Jesus brought with them a paralyzed man laying on a mat. And my assumption here is that these mat carriers wanted to get this guy in front of Jesus. And I think there's evidence of that by the insane measures these guys go to make this happen. For starters, there was this huge crowd that had gathered, and there was no way anybody, let alone a group of people with a man on a mat in tow, were going to penetrate that crowd that surrounded the home Jesus was in. And yet these people found another way. After working their way around the crowd, they then engaged the Herculean task of making their way to the roof of this house. And I don't think we should breeze past that detail of this story, because this was a group of people, according to Mark, at least 4 human beings, who had a guy that didn't have the use of his extremities splayed out on a blanket for all intents and purposes. This was no easy feat to climb up a story high with just a simple ladder as a tool. And yet they persisted and they succeeded. And then as they opened the roof in such a way that no one below them was harmed, we watched them exercise what I would consider to be a grand physics exhibit. They get this guy on a mat without toppling him over to the exact spot he needs to be in order to have an immediate audience with Christ. Luke goes on to report that Jesus not only healed the man of his physical ailments, but he also freed him from his spiritual bondage pronouncing him forgiven of all his sin. And while there is so much we can extract from this story, this morning I want to zero in on God's invitation to participate, his invitation to be an active part of his mission and of his kingdom building work here on earth, his invitation to others to be a part of the cosmic divine conversation to which he invites us all in worship. As a worship leader, I resonate deeply with the mat carriers in this story because I believe my calling is not only to receive God's invitation to participate myself in worship, but also to extend that invitation to those I'm called to lead and shepherd. And this requires my regular reevaluation and reacceptance of the holy work to which I'm called. And so, in the example of the mat carriers, I'm reminded that God's invitation to participate calls us as worship leaders to be faith filled. I've often wondered if this man on the mat had any real hope that day that he would return home on foot. Or was he, after years of being crippled, simply resigned to his current plight in life? And in that same way, I wonder how many of us watch our congregants enter the sanctuary week in and week out, just going through the motions, but otherwise having lost all hope that God will truly engage them in any sort of transformative way. As mat carriers, I believe we are called to lend our faith to those who have lost hope, that our God, who promises to reveal himself, will be faithful to do so. These mat carriers also remind me that God's invitation to participate calls us as worship leaders to be creative, to engage every ability and resource we have been given for the sake of those we're called to lead in the conversation of worship. These guys carrying this man on the mat that day weren't deterred by the dense crowds or the seemingly insurmountable challenges of getting their friend an audience with Jesus. Instead, they employed the resources of their imagination and their intellects, and they found an alternative, creative way to ensure this man's engagement with Christ. And as worship leaders, I believe we are called to continually and consistently hone our skills, to constantly think outside of the box, not for the sake of creativity alone, but so that others might be able to receive God's great invitation to participate. Finally, these mat carriers remind me that this amazing invitation we receive from God to participate requires us as worship leaders to be sacrificial in the way that we lead. I'm guessing that each and every one of those mat carriers had their own needs that day, their own reasons for wanting to get an audience with Jesus. And yet we don't read that after the hole was torn in the roof and the plan had been devised to get that guy in front of Jesus, a few of them said, "Hey, hang on just a minute, man, we'll be right back for you." And then watch them jump to first get in front of Christ, to lay their needs before him primarily. Instead, they sacrificially used their energies and this opportunity for the sake of someone whose needs seemed far greater than their own. And as I think about that, I would imagine that many of you as worship leaders lead each and every week with your own burdens, your own needs to lay before God. And yet in receiving God's invitation to participate in his ongoing work in this world, I believe that we commit ourselves to put the needs of others before our own, with the goal of empowering and equipping as many as possible to participate in the worship of our God. It's been spoken so beautifully in a number of ways this week that our God is a God of invitation. And certainly one of God's most amazing invitations for us is to participate in his ongoing kingdom work here on earth. So as you receive this invitation from God anew this morning and this week, it is my prayer that you will continue to fulfill this call with great faith, with amazing creativity, and with sacrificial hearts, and in so doing, be able, by the power of God, to extend this invitation to those you are called to lead, joining God in his kingdom building work here on earth. The Lord be with you. Amen.
May